this workshop. So you are very welcome, Professor Mazur and Professor Valdivia.
Well, thank you so much, Jorge, for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I have been to Colombia many times. I would have loved to come for this meeting to Colombia. It's one of my favorite Latin American countries. Unfortunately, we are all stuck at home. I hope you're all safe and well. It's frightening times. I don't know about your university, but Harvard decided back in July last year that we would be teaching remotely for the entire academic year. So we have no face-to-face instruction. Well, we have a lot of face-to-face instruction, but it's online rather than in person. And I have to say, there are quite a few interesting surprises. One, I know my students much better than I ever know them before because you see all their faces, they're right there. It's as if they're all sitting in the front row and they all have their name displayed. So I get to associate a face with a name. Unfortunately, I don't see you, so I will not be able to associate a face with a name. So be sure to introduce yourself in the chat so that other people know who you are, where you're from, and that you have a way of connecting with others. I will not be able to read the chat while I talk because it's too distracting, but I will definitely catch up later. So one surprise is I get to know my students better, and they're all sitting in the front row. The second one is that I have in my how long have I been teaching? I've been teaching about 38 years at Harvard, a long time. In my 38 years of teaching at Harvard, I have never had students work so hard and be so dedicated to learning. Learning not to pass an exam, but really learning. So I in a sense, I find that the transformation is remarkable. It's in part because I have adapted my pedagogy to a scenario like the one through which you and I are now talking. I'll say a little bit about that at the end of my 40 minutes. Hola, Ricardo. Thank you for joining from Bogota. Okay, so let's get started here. I prepared a few slides for you. So I'm going to put the first one on. So as the title of this workshop, and it will not be a workshop in the proper sense, right? Given the platform Zoom webinar rather than Zoom meeting, it is difficult to do an interaction. If we had used Zoom meeting, then we could actively have used the interaction that I use in my class. But I'll describe it to you so you can at least imagine it. So it's a workshop without too much work. Isn't that great? My students would be really happy because I make them work very, very hard. So the title is Active Learning and Perusal. And Pablo and I are going to share with you practices for successful engagement in learning, and even more so for successful engagement online. If maybe one of the organizers could go to the participant list and turn off the chime on entry, it will be a little bit more quiet as people come and go. So in order to put the active learning and the perusal in context, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story. On the internet, you'll find plenty of longer versions of that. I'm going to give you a very short version of that so that you can put the active learning in the context of learning in general, and in particular contrast it with passive learning. And then see why 7 years ago, I started thinking about developing a platform, Perusall, which we're going to tell you about. And Pablo is going to show how it's used in his courses in linguistics. The platform has been catapulted into a success story this year. In 2020, we've added close to 1 million users. We're in total at 1.2 million users worldwide. many in Latin America, many in Europe, all over the US, Asia. Yeah, I mean, there's not a continent except Antarctica where we have users, active users. So I hope that you will consider using it for your teaching. It's entirely free. Okay, so in order to put this in context, let's go back a long time, 38 years ago when I started teaching at Harvard. See, when I started teaching at Harvard, I had not really been trained to teach. There were no courses. I mean, essentially, I'd been a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard for a number of years. They promoted me from postdoc, where I did only research, to assistant professor. And at the time, they asked me, of course, to teach, because the name professor means you are also teaching. Now, I had never been trained to teach. So I certainly did not ask myself, which is kind of strange, the question, how am I going to teach? It was perfectly clear how I was going to teach. The question did not even come up in my mind. I was going to teach my class the same way my professors had taught me, and namely to lecture. You can see here a picture of me teaching my introductory physics class back in the 1980s, not quite 1984, but actually, no, forget about 1984. It was taken BC, before computers. I'm not that old. Before computers. You can see I'm using an overhead projector here in front of the classroom. Anyway, why did I do that? Why did I teach this way? Well, I taught this way because, in a sense, I projected my own experiences onto my own world. And I think we all tend to do that. Maybe you did the same when you started teaching. I unconsciously thought, this is how I learned physics, therefore I'm going to teach my students. I think that's a natural thing that we humans all do. We see the world around us through the lenses of our experience. Anyway, so I'm sure that my professors made the same assumption when they started. And so did their professor, and the professor who taught the professors of my professors, and back generation after generation after generation after generation, all the way until this person here. This is an illustration from an illuminated manuscript from the 14th century, representing a scene that took place in the 11th century at the University of Bologna in Italy. It's King Henry of Germany, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, giving a guest lecture at the University of Bologna, as I said. And the resemblance between that picture or that illustration and the picture from my classroom is pretty remarkable. I mean, you see right away what each one represents. And true, we don't wear those robes anymore when we go to class. We still wear them at graduation to remind ourselves that we're steeped in medieval traditions. But apart from the clothing, this looks like a pretty familiar scene. And look at that. The students in the front row here are paying close attention. In the second row, they look a little bit more bored and less interested. In the third row, they're just talking to each other, just like they are here in the back corner. And then there's this person here who's either fast asleep or just cringing in agony. Anyway, the point I want to make is very little has changed in close to 1,000 years of education. And I'm sure that if you and I go back to our campuses and we look around into different classrooms, we'll probably still see this scene. So please click on the chat button at the bottom of the screen, because I'm going to ask you a question and I want you to put something in the chat pretty soon. Now, something really interesting happened. You see, I was asked to teach a course that none of my colleagues wanted to teach: physics for pre-medical students. These were not students who wanted to learn physics. No, they already hated physics before coming into my classroom. They just took physics because they had to, because somebody told them, if you don't take your physics course, you're not going to be able to go to medical school. Now, it turns out that pre-medical students are not very kind to physicists. And as a result, at the end of the semester, most of my colleagues would receive very poor evaluations. And therefore, they didn't like to teach this course. And they asked me, the new professor, the new assistant professor, to teach this course. I didn't know any of this. I only found out later. So, as I said, I started lecturing. And the interesting thing that happened was this. One, the students liked what I was doing. They gave me high evaluations. So clearly they liked me as a lecturer. And secondly, they did well on what I considered difficult exam. I could give these students some really, really hard problems. Problems I wasn't sure I would do well on under the time pressure of an exam. But by and large, they did well. So they liked me as an instructor. They did well on complicated exams. Clearly, I was doing the right thing. In fact, very quickly, I started to believe that I was the world's best physics teacher. After all, I managed to do something that my colleagues at Harvard did not manage to do. Now, that turned out to be a complete illusion. It was a very pleasant illusion, but it was an illusion nonetheless. And that illusion went on for many years. I think probably something about like 6 years, until the illusion was shattered by something that happened in my classroom. I had read in an article on research in physics education that students who are not majoring in physics learn very little in their introductory physics courses. And that statement was based on research that a number of professors of Arizona State University had done in their introductory physics classes. Instead of asking the usual textbook or examination problems, they asked questions with just words, reflecting daily life, to see if students could transfer their physics knowledge from the physics classroom context into a context that was our daily life context, the one that you and I experience every day. And they showed that students do A, very poorly on answering those questions, and B, instruction does nothing to change it. So if you ask those questions at the beginning of the term, and then again at the end of the term, you see no difference. I looked at that question, and knowing that I was the world's best physics teacher, I thought, no way, not in my classroom. But I'm a scientist. So one of the things you learn as a scientist is not to make any assertions. So I thought, you know what? I am going to show that my students can ace this test. And what happened was that my students actually did very poorly on the test too. In fact, one student, shortly after I gave that quiz, and this was close to the end of the semester, raised her hand, and she looked at me and asked, how should I answer these questions? According to what you taught us, or according to the way I usually think about these things? I looked at her. I had no idea how to answer that question. And, you know, by the time I looked at the data from this test, it was clear that my illusionary world of being a good teacher was just a house of cards. So let's go back for a moment to this situation. I would like you to put in the chat in 1 or 2 words, and ideally I want to hear one word that is a verb. What is going on in the process depicted in that slide? And the 2 verbs I do not want to hear are teaching and learning. So you'll have to come up with other words. So put it in the chat. Describe to me in 1 or 2 words, one of which is a verb, what is going on. Memorization, says one of the users. Pay attention. Thank you. I hope they're paying attention. At least, you know, you can see that in my class, there's nobody like this. Okay, memorization, pay attention. Let's get some more there. Yep. Oh, Joseph Potvin said memorization. Good. Doesn't matter who says it. Just keep going. Listening. Repetition, showing. Notice that the verbs that we've heard so far either refer to me, I am showing, they're not showing anything. They're listening, I'm not listening. Maybe they follow instructions, I don't follow instruction. Maybe they're memorizing, I'm not memorizing. So all the words that we've heard so far refer either to them or to me, but we're both in the same room at the same time. What is it that is happening between them and me as a teacher? What is it that is happening between you and me now here in this workshop? Interaction, says Jacqueline. Interact, says Clara Elena. Well, and communication, says Ricardo. Let's take those words here. Pause for a moment here. Communication, to me, is a two-way process. We're trying to communicate. It's kind of difficult to communicate because I don't see you, I don't hear you. We have to go through the chat, but at least there's something coming back. I would say in this picture here on my slide there's nothing coming back. There are things going from me to them. There's nothing coming back. So it's definitely no communication. It's no interaction either, because interaction means something goes from me to them and something comes back. But look at them there. They're all scribbling in their notebooks and sitting there passively listening, as somebody said. Clara says transmitting. Exactly. Lectures focus on transmitting. So my next question then is, transmitting what? What is it that is being transmitted in that classroom? What does the flow of these arrows represent? Jacqueline says concepts. Patricia says information. Let's see if we see other things that come there. What is it that knowledge, says Clara. So let's go backwards here. Let's first think about knowledge. Is knowledge something that can be transmitted? I wish it could be transmitted. I don't think it can be transmitted. After trying to transmit knowledge from, close to 40 years, I can tell you it cannot be transmitted. It needs to be constructed in the brain of the learner. You did not receive the knowledge that you have. You constructed the knowledge you have by working, studying, sweating, thinking. So constructing, as Lali says. So I think we can't really transmit knowledge. We cannot really transmit concepts. We can only transmit information. And where did the information end up? Look at this picture. Where did it end up? I'll tell you where it ended up. It ended up in the notebooks of the students. You see that they're all taking notes here. So in a sense, the lecture is a process where the information gets transferred from the lecture notes of the instructor to the notebooks of the students without passing through the brains of either. And that's when I realized, when my students did so poorly and I started to reflect on what the lecture, una clase magistral, really represents, it became clear that education is so much more than just a transfer of information. Yes, you have to have transfer of information, but on top of that, the learner needs to make sense of that information, needs to have the aha moments. Oh, yeah, now I understand it. Think about your own courses that you took when you were a student. Where did that sense making, that aha moment, where did that take place? Did it take place while you were sitting in a classroom like the one you just saw here, listening to your professor's talk? I'd say probably not. Maybe sometimes, but most of it occurred outside of class, when you were looking at your notes and thinking, I don't understand this, or looking things up. So in the traditional approach to teaching, the emphasis in class is on the transmittal of information. And then we leave the second part, the sense making, to the students on their own. And I think we all agree the hard part, the key to education, is not this first part. We all have information coming out of everywhere, our phones, our computers, books, you name it. The hard part is really to understand this information, to make sense of the information, to extract from the information the knowledge that permits you to apply what you've learned in a new context. It's kind of ironic that in the traditional approach to teaching, which has been going on for 1,000 years, if not more, the emphasis is on the easy part and we leave the hard part to our students. So that's when I realized, I'm really focusing on the wrong thing. I should be focusing on this. I should make my time with my students available to help them make sense of the information. So that's when I came up with the idea, this was 1991, so almost 30 years ago, to switch this, to move the information transfer out of class and have the student be responsible for reading or watching, but I used reading the information before coming to class, so that in class we can work on sense making. And the approach I use, which I will not discuss in any detail, so if you're interested in that approach, there are plenty of recordings of my talks online that you can look at. I used an approach called peer instruction, instrucción entre pares. And essentially, the idea for that is very simple. Oh, pardon me, forget this slide. It's very simple. It's teach by questioning rather than by telling. Now, that was not a new idea. It was not an Eric Mazur idea at all. Who said that first, that we should teach by questioning rather than by telling? Put it in the chat. Who was the first person? It was not Eric Mazur. It was Socrates. Socrates 2,000 years ago already realized the best way to teach is through questioning, not through telling. And here we are in the 21st century. And still, I don't know about your institution, but even at my institution, many of my colleagues are still teaching by telling, as if Gutenberg had not invented the printing press 600 years ago. It's amazing. So anyway, so I have my students read before class, and then in class, I talk a few minutes, much shorter than I do with you now, and then I ask a question, a word-based conceptual question. I give them time to think about the question. I aim the questions in such a way that about half the students are able to rationally choose an answer, correct or desired, whichever way you want to call it. In science, you would probably call it the correct answer. In the humanities, it might be the desired answer rather than the correct answer. After giving them 1 or 2 minutes to think in silence, I have them vote. There are many high-tech ways. In fact, Pablo is going to show you a platform that is free to use, which can be used for polling. Initially, when I did it, there was no technology. There were no cell phones. There was nothing. So we did it by having students put their hand on their chest and use fingers to indicate their choices. So choice 1, choice 2, choice 3, choice 4, choice 5. And, even if you have a class of 100 and you tell them, everybody at the same time, put your hand on your chest, indicating your choice, you get a pretty good sense of the answers that are being given. So I try to get this so that it's about 50-50. Now, then I tell them, find a neighbor who has a different answer. Which answer did you give? Oh, I gave the same. Thank you. Which answer did you give? And if I find somebody has a different answer, we start discussing the answer. Why did you give that answer? I thought that. And what happens is that the students very effectively convince each other of the right answer. Why? Because they don't suffer from what Susan Ambrose calls the expert blind spot. Unlike me, who learned it a long, long time ago and have forgotten how a beginning learner learns, they still remember what the difficulties are a beginning learner is. And if I poll them again after 2 or so minutes, they do significantly better. If it's 50% initially, like in this very first poll, it's not this first poll here, it's not unusual to have close to 100% in the second poll. I finish with a discussion, which can be either them explaining the right answer or me, and then the cycle repeats. And that's what happens in class. And the great thing is, during these discussions, that's when the aha moments occur. You'll see students talk to each other, and then one goes, oh, yeah, that makes sense. Now I get it. Anyway, using this method, I immediately demonstrated significant learning gains. In my lecture, I got a relatively low normalized gain. I doubled it the first year that I did peer instruction. And then by improving the questions I asked in class, tripled it. And then many people all around the world have shown similar data in many different disciplines. And also better retention of knowledge, because once you have this aha moment, you're no longer at the memorization level. You're already one level up in Bloom's taxonomy. Pablo will show you Bloom's taxonomy. We want to get much higher than that, but at least you're one level up from memorization. But also retention of students, because we noticed, and colleagues of mine noticed, that other institutions, including community colleges, which are at a totally different level from universities, that student retention is higher. Far fewer students, and especially minorities, drop out from their programs. So I want to spend the last 11 minutes I have here to briefly talk about the other part. I've talked about the sense making. What about the information transfer? If you don't lecture, if you've eliminated that, how do you best transfer the information? And it was not until about 6 or 7 years ago that I actually sat down to think about it. Kind of strange, because I always thought, I'll just tell my students, read chapter 22 before coming to class Tuesday. And of course, I would notice that some students didn't read it, but they'd be lost in class and they discover the hard way that it's better to read beforehand. And I see here somebody say that this is related to the Harvard case method. Yes, but instead of being student to the instructor, other student to the instructor, it's all together at the same time. If I have a class of 100 students, all 100 talk at the same time, pairwise or in groups of 3. So in that sense, it is more efficient than the case method because everybody's involved at the same time. But what it shares with the case method is that you have to come to class prepared. Now, how do you get to class prepared? How do you make sure that the information is transferred at least to the same level as it would be had I given a lecture, una clase magistral, where I would essentially have just talked to the students? Well, initially I thought, why not have them watch my lectures? I have them recorded. So maybe they can just watch the recorded lectures online. Well, we didn't have them online there because there was no online, but we had the videotapes. So I quickly backed off of that idea for the following reason. If you have a video, then the transfer pace, the rate at which the information flows, is set by the video. And what happens when a student passively listens to somebody, either live, like you listening to me live, or passively watching a video, your brain is held hostage by the presenter. You cannot raise your hand and say, Professor Mazur, could you please be quiet for a few minutes? I need to think. Can't do that. In fact, in my 40 years of teaching, no student has ever done that to me. And I would be surprised if a student has done it in your class. So there is no opportunity to cognitively engage with the material. The best you can do if you're confused is make a quick note and then tell yourself, I'm going to think about this later. But you know what? Maybe a student who becomes an expert in our field will do that. Most of our students are not going to be experts in our field. They're interested in very different things. So the chance that they will actually sit down and figure it out is much lower. The other thing is, with video, you're passive. So you're back to this passive role that you have in the lecture too. And also from the data of edX and other platforms like Coursera, you see that students don't even really watch the whole video. Maybe they watch the whole video the first class, and the second class they discover that they can just pretend having watched, and towards the end of the semester they don't watch anything anymore. And lastly, and most importantly, it's an isolated individual experience, the video and the student. But deep down, learning is a social experience. We learn together from each other, you and I, when we were students. You and I now, as we are experts in our field, we learn with graduate students, we learn with colleagues, we learn at conferences like this. So learning is a social experience, and watching a video alone doesn't help. So then we thought, let's actually, by having them watch a video, you move this out of the classroom so that you don't see it, which doesn't mean it's not happening. So then I thought, you know what, let's go to printed media, text. Text has a lot of advantage because now the reader is in control of the transfer pace, right? If you read something and you get confused and you start thinking, your mind starts wandering, you stop reading because you can't think and read at the same time. So you are in control of the transfer pace. And the other thing is that a lot of research has shown that the brain is much more active in reading than in watching. But we still have a problem. We don't really have any accountability. How do I know that my students are actually reading something? And it's still an isolated individual experience. What do we want? What we want, if we don't lecture, but we want to do more meaningful things in the classroom, is we want every student to be prepared for every class from the beginning of the semester to the end of the semester. Without, ideally, I don't know about you, but I'm pretty busy, without having to put an additional effort. You know, suddenly it hit me 6 or 7 years ago, and I do not know why it took me so long. Right? I mean, 30 years ago, I started to make the classroom a more social experience. It was a social interaction between the students that helped improve instruction. And suddenly 7 years ago, I should turn the out of class component also into a social interaction. So that's when we started to develop Perusall, which essentially at its heart is a social learning platform. It can handle both text and video and permits students to interact with that text. So students log in either through their LMS. We use Canvas at Harvard. I don't know what they use in Groningen, whether it's Canvas or Blackboard or Moodle, but it's compatible with all of these platforms. Or they log in through their social profile. And once you're logged in, it looks like an e-reader. With one little twist, you can see who else is online. So in my class, if I were to go there right now, I would see probably 10, 20 students online. And if you put your cursor over their avatars, you can see their names. While you're reading, if there's something you don't understand, you can highlight it. And as you highlight it, it opens a chat window. And then you can put text in the chat window. And as you hit return, the highlight sticks. And so after a while, there'll be highlights everywhere. And if I'm reading this text and I wonder, hey, why did somebody highlight it? I can click on it and I see the transcript of the chat that students had. Look at this. I'm going to make it a little bit larger. I hope you can read it. Here's one student who on October 20th, so what is that? It was 2 days ago, said, I don't understand how this combination of factors tells you anything about direction. Aren't blah, 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 and so forth. About half an hour later, another student here said, I think you may be able to think about the direction separately, blah, 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 blah. 2 days later, October 22nd, this was not this year, this was actually last year, at 8:48 p.m., a third student said, this is a great question. To further elaborate on this, blah, 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 and so on. So how do you get students to participate? Well, we use a combination of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation drives. And I don't really have time to say very much about it, but a little bit the platform tries to nudge students to display a behavior that's conducive to learning, to reply to each other, to start early, to come back. And it will message the students in order to pull them back into the platform. It's very much a social platform. So for example, in my course, which has 60 students, I get 20,000 annotations in one semester. So I can already hear you. How do you process all of that information? Well, it's all completely automated. We use a machine learning algorithm that has been adapted to this type of content. It works in Spanish, it works in English, it works in Dutch, and it works in a number of other languages. which actually assesses intellectual context, and it actually evaluates students' engagement. So not only do I get scores of engagement in the LMS gradebook, I can even connect, and I know Pablo is going to tell you a little bit more about this, the pre and in-class activities. Because what the program does is it determines what the three main topics of confusion are. And for each of these three topics, it shows three exemplar questions and more if you click on the More button. So all I need to do before class is look at this confusion report, and then I can come to class prepared with questions that are good to discuss, because they're not questions in my mind, they're questions in the student's mind. So in a sense, Perusall offers me a window into the brains of my students, so that when I come to class and I meet them, I can actually answer their needs rather than on what needs I perceive them to have. So the motivating factors are the social interaction. I haven't shown it to you, but it's a lot of fun to be on the platform, to see the little bubbles of people popping up and speaking and talking, and you can chat and you can meet your friends. The other thing is that students discover very quickly the connection between the pre-class assignment and the in-class activity. The two are connected to each other. And lastly, if you want, you can add an extrinsic component through the assessment, which is fully automated. Let me show you some data, and I'm going to wrap up and hand it over to Pablo. So this here shows the percentage of the students out of 100, which is right here somewhere, and the number of the chapters they missed reading before class. They had to read 17 chapters in my course in one semester. So there are no data above 6 because no student missed 7 chapters. And the 3 different colors are 3 different years while we were adjusting the algorithm that does the nudging and the assessment. Black is the most recent algorithm that we have. So first of all, notice that with the most current algorithm, no student misses 5 or more. There's maybe 1 or 2 students who don't read 4 chapters or don't annotate 4 chapters, a few 3, a few 2, but look at that, 70% misses 0. Every single of the 17 chapters they read before class and they annotated. I don't know about you, but I miss things sometimes. Students get sick, they may have an exam in another course, they may have a problem, a family problem, whatever. 70% has no problems at all, reads everything throughout the term. In fact, if you add these first 3 bins, which means that a few students miss 1 chapter and even less 2, you're very close to 95%. I think this is as close as you can ever come to having every student prepared for every class. Now, I did this pre-pandemic. When the pandemic hit in March and we were told, off campus you go, I was totally well prepared, because remember, this was already out of class. It was done on Perusall. The peer instruction was done in class, but it was really easy to do this online. This is already online, and the interaction, teaching by questioning, can easily be done on Zoom with breakout rooms, right? You ask a question, you send students to the breakout room so they can talk, 3 or 4 students per breakout room, and then you have them vote again, and they come back. Next question. Vote, think, vote, go into the breakout rooms, vote again, come out, do the explanation. It works beautifully. I wish I could do it with you right now, but you can at least imagine it. So I hope I've convinced you that education is not only about information transfer. You have to have something that is more meaningful. We want our students not just to memorize and do what we do. We want them to go beyond what we can do. And in order to accomplish that, it's absolutely essential to engage them. And also, and this is the point with which I want to leave you with, to turn teaching into a social experience in the classroom, in the live session online, or in the classroom when it's on campus, and a social interaction outside of the classroom when they study and Perusall is a great way of providing them a platform to socially interact with each other and work together to understand the material. Thank you so much for your attention. I am happy to stay here and answer questions. I'll be monitoring the chat while you get the second part, and then we'll answer questions at the end. Pablo, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Eric, for your great presentation. Now I will share my screen. I have here my presentation. Okay, so I hope everybody can see my screen. Basically, I titled this part of the presentation as Aprender Haciendo, because what actually I'm going to do is to explain how actually all the findings, all the pioneering work of Eric Mazur has inspired not only me, but an entire program of studies here at the University of Groningen. So first, before I start developing my ideas and to explain you how I applied Perusall in the specific context of the program of European cultures and literature, I would like to ask you, I would like to know more about you. I would like to know what are the common challenges that do we usually face when teaching our courses. So I would like to know more about what are the challenges that you are facing, for instance, now under the COVID-19 pandemic, and which are these kind of difficulties that you are facing when you are preparing your courses or teaching them. So please go to Minty here, minty.com, and use these codes. Your answers will be reflected here on the screen. I will give you just a couple of minutes or a minute or so. Please, if you want to write in Spanish also, you can do it. It's okay. So yes, I would like to have an idea of what are the actual problems you face in your classes, because I want this part of the session that you can see what actually Perusall can do for you. Yes, so lack of motivation by students. Yes, and we have all experienced this. Eric was explaining this also before. Unwillingness to change. What else? What other challenges have you faced or encountered in your own teaching? Lack of inspiration from teachers. Yes, I'll give you a couple of minutes. Unprepared students. Yes, complexity of the content, yes. Disconnection after a while. Yeah, so it seems that we have a lot of common challenges and common problems when we are preparing our courses or teaching them, especially under this current situation where we have turned many of our courses into remote teaching or online teaching. Any other challenges that you have encountered when teaching your courses? Yes, to involve SS in the sense-making practices. Good. Lack of interest from the students. Keeping them engaged. That is a good one. Keeping them engaged. I'm going to highlight it. Yeah, because engagement is going to be one of the key words here in this part of my presentation. Lack of engaging activities for students. Yes. Yeah, so here you see that we can actually summarize on 2 or 3 general issues, which are lack of motivation by students. The content is complex, of course, and students might feel forced to disconnect after a while, or also the lack of the unpreparation of the students, so the lack of being prepared before the class, and so on, how to keep them engaged. Well, you know that I didn't know any of you, well, perhaps 2 or 3 people who are there in the participants, but many of you, I didn't know you, and I prepared actually a slide with some general common challenges we face in the humanities. So yes, actually, here also we had this challenge of basically having students do not prepare the weekly assignments or readings, so they are unprepared before the class. Also, something very difficult regarding motivation and inspiring students, how to overcome the punishment learning mindset. So basically, students that they only well do their assignments or readings if there is a kind of extrinsic punishment or extrinsic strong motivation. Also, this is something that you find embedded in the learning culture of many instructors, right? So they understand that they are the authority, and the students, they are some kind of empty jar that must be filled with the knowledge of the instructor. Also, another common challenge that we find is how to develop a sense of ownership. Eric, in his great presentation, he was explaining how it was important to develop the notion of intrinsic motivation, the motivation of the students for actually engaging in their own learning process. And specifically in the case of my discipline, also was very difficult to make students to engage with certain contents that they found complex and difficult, too difficult for them to understand, which is in the case of cultural and literary studies. And finally, sometimes, and something was also mentioned in the previous slide, is how this connects. And students many times they disconnect because actually it is us who are failing to meet their student needs and their expectations. So these were also some common challenges that I faced myself where I started working here at the University of Groningen. So thanks to our common friend and colleague Hans Belhaus, who introduced me into this motto education in science and using well evidence-based information towards learning, so to actually to take decisions which are very well informed, not on our own likes or dislikes, but actually things that actually work in learning, as Eric was explaining before. Well, we managed to develop certain ideas inspired by Eric Mazur on how to improve the student experience when they are actually taking our lessons and participating in our educational programs. Actually, we published this joint article where we started to look at how to improve learning in flipped classrooms, where we could use social annotation tools as the specific case of Perusall. So actually, what we found is that we have some active learning, what we can call so active learning specific challenges, because as Eric said, simply if you take the transfer of knowledge out of your class, it's not resulting automatically in a major engagement, or it's not going to awake the intrinsic motivation of your students. So we looked at this from a scientific point of view, looking at all the data we had on different aspects. And we understood that one very particular challenge was to provide the right inclusion for students, not only in terms of digital literacy, but also creating, as Eric said before, we wanted to apply Eric's idea of creating this learning experience. So for us, it was a major challenge how to actually accomplish this. And in order to accomplish this, we also had to resolve first some problems. How we were going to activate students, how we were going to make sure that they were going to develop the intrinsic motivation needed in order to excel, but also to participate and to build up together with other peers this learning network that we wanted the class to be. So then we decided to decenter the class. So instead of centering the class around the auctoritas of the instructor, Eric was explaining this in some slides before when he was showing this clase magistral with this lecturer just transferring information to students in a classroom and so on. So we wanted to decenter the learning experience and to base this into put it in the hands of the student. And also something very important that also we learned working with Eric was that it was essential and very important that for a successful change in the paradigm, change in the mindset from a mindset based on this punishment mentality to another one based on intrinsic motivation and student-centered learning, it was very important that the students actually they can see with something tangible, something very specific, how they can apply the knowledge and the skills that they have gained through their training. So what I will do in the next minutes is actually to provide a kind of a guides or pillars for a successful learning experience, especially now that is posing so many challenges under the current COVID-19 pandemic. So the pillar one is going to relate to the planning and designing of a course. The pillar two about the teaching and the actual learning that happens during the course. And the pillar three, and this is very important on purpose, I have removed the notion of assessment that I know that Eric and we think alike in this, and we are not great fans of the notion of assessment. For us, it's more important how we provide personalized quality feedback and how we manage to develop skills in the students that will stay with them for the rest of their lives. And therefore, meta-learning is one of these skills that is absolutely essential for them to acquire. So now I want to count also with the participation of the participants of this workshop. And I have prepared this diagram. So now I would like to ask you, from one, so the diagram external layer, so this external layer, to 5, the diagram core layer, I would like you to choose 5 key terms for effective planning and designing. So basically, think about 5 key terms that you consider absolutely essential when you are planning and designing your courses. From what it would be, let's say, at this external layer, something more general, something that it would be kind of philosophy of teaching, general approach to teaching, to the very core of what you consider is the most important in your courses when you are planning them and designing them. I will give you a couple of minutes to respond to this question. Yes, so the idea is like, for instance, you say, number one, whatever you think is number one, extrinsic motivation, or number one, auctoritas model, number two, etc. So think about like what would be 5 key terms that you will hierarchically order when planning and designing your course. They are not good or wrong questions. They're not right or wrong questions. Simply, I'm curious to know what is actually your experience and how do you reflect about what you are going to teach before actually teaching it. Yeah, perhaps this is a lot of quite difficult ones, a lot of reflections. Know the student interest, goods. Good. This is a good one. Ages, interests, contents of the level, methodology, resources. So resources is the core for these participants. Yeah. So anybody like this response, somebody that's also provided this sort of hierarchical view from what is, let's say, the could be a philosophy of teaching and going to something very specific when planning and designing. Good, I see here more responses. I see, so 5 institutional policies, 4 resources, 3 time available, 2 content selection, 1 student needs. Yeah, that is interesting, yes, yes. Because actually the design, the pedagogy and design and planning of your course is going to make the difference. If you want to use a great social learning platform such as Perusall. And this is one of the most common mistakes that some colleagues on instructors they do, is to not think carefully about the planning and designing and simply straight away use Perusall, right? And it's something I always explain in all my talks. If you use Perusall in order to have a successful learning engagement, you need to have very clear ideas on actually what you want to achieve with your students. So in that sense, my suggestion, now I pass to my own suggestion about how I plan and design my courses. Actually, first I start with the so-called backwards design. So backward design means that you look at the aims and results that you are expecting and the skills and competencies that you're expecting your students to obtain at the end of the course, right? So instead of starting from the content, they have many colleagues who say, I want my students to know all the history of Spanish literature. Okay, this is not my aim. For me, that is totally useless. For that, we already have the internet. But for me, what is interesting is to look at which are the different competencies that I want my students to master at the end of the course. And then when I have a clear picture about which are these competencies and skills, then I look at what is going to be the actual architecture of the course by looking at which elements will align in a constructive way. So basically everything that is part of the course, every element of the course, from the learning goals to the way I'm going to provide the feedback, how are going to sequentiate the knowledge that I want to transfer, and so on and so forth, is very well aligned. Actually, the notion of constructive alignments, as I will show later, comes from one colleague, researcher called John Biggs. Then I come to the inferior level, let's say, in my planning and designing, and I look to the active learning strategy. So already in an early part of the planning and designing of my course, I look at which activities are going to be helpful to make sure that my students are not only feeling included, but also they are activated and ready before every class, prepared before every class. So I can think of different sort of strategies. It could be, for instance, something like team-based learning, project-based learning. It could be other sort of strategies that have been proved in the past to be successful, such as peer instruction. So as I said before, the approach that we took when renewing our program was based on evidence that we had already about what was working and not. And then the other layer that for me is absolutely essential is to reflect on how I'm going to integrate and how I'm going to align these previous layers, and especially the strategies I'm going to use in my courses, on how this is actually in a tangible way facilitate the intrinsic motivation of my students. I'm going to show you a very specific example in a second. And finally, at the core of my planning and designing always is interaction. Why? Because if we want to decenter the class, or at least to change the way from the instructor to the student, it's very important that then everything that is planned, everything that is organized within one particular course is actually aiming at activating students through interaction. So now I would like to show you what are some of these expected results and competencies that in the backward design I take into consideration. So for instance, instead of looking at memorization, it was one of the notions that you mentioned before, or the competencies you mentioned before. For me, at the top of, or the central interest of what I want my students to master when they finish a course with me, is creative and innovative thinking and design, right? Also, of course, if I want my students to gain these competencies, I need them to be also trained in critical thinking and problem solving, which is connected also to the previous expected result and competencies. On top of that, what I want then is to be agile, to gain adaptability, and also to understand that what they are learning in my class is something that is going to stay with them for the rest of their lives, and they can apply not only in an academic environment, but also outside. Therefore, I need to activate them through certain strategies, and therefore, as Eric said before, if you translate the learning experience into a social experience, then you have to facilitate teamwork and collaboration. In this particular case of the COVID-19 crisis, especially in virtual environments. This will help me to basically build with my students a sense of initiative, so intrinsic motivation, autonomy, self-regulation, entrepreneurship. And the idea is that not only they gain all these competencies and they obtain these expected results, but also they gain ways of doing this in an effective way by promoting their skills for obtaining effective oral and written communication. And finally, what is very specific in the case of my field, is very important that they develop strong skills, multilingual skills, so they can work in several languages at the same time and develop a strong knowledge and base on cultural knowledge. So why I said that creating is one of the main and most important competencies I want my students to obtain and to master at the end of one of my courses, is because, as Eric was explaining before, in the Bloom's taxonomy, I'm not going to enter into detail, explain what the Bloom's taxonomy is and so on, but in the Bloom's taxonomy, which was in the revised version, which is this one, creating, evaluating, and analyzing are at the top of the complexity and cognitive complexity that actually our students can produce. So this is why, instead of placing first remembering and understanding, which was something that's in a traditional setup, it would be the mainstream way of instructing students. In my case, what I want my students is that they can create info that they can be used to create something new, something different, that also they can evaluate and critically assess and make judgments, and they can analyze and also explore relationships. So these three very complex categories are key in order to activate my students, and they are always at the rear of this pedagogy design that I use with Perusall. In this sense, I try to innovate a little bit more, even going further, and propose what I call the enactivist configuration, where actually students, when they create something, they actually understand the nature of that object, or that's a problem that they are assessing and they are creating and they are engaging with, right? So for me, actually creating and understanding are pretty much connected. So in the course, following the ideas of John Biggs, as I said before, it's very important that learning goals are completely well aligned with learning strategies, teaching methods, and feedback. Unless these three elements are well aligned in your course, it's very difficult that any great technology such as Perusall will actually work. So it's very important that your course design is very clear, is very strong, is well aligned. Otherwise, any use of technology might be fruitless. So what I did was actually take the ideas by Eric Mazur about peer instruction and rethinking assessment. I really recommend you to watch this great video by Eric, as you have already seen. He's a great, fascinating speaker. So I really recommend you to watch this video, Assessment, the Silent Killer of Learning, because it will change your ideas about actually what should be the goal and the role of the teacher in the class. And also how the class, it should not be a class anymore, but actually should facilitate the learning experience, as also pointed out by Randy Garrison with his community of inquiry framework and collaborative learning, right? So then I would like to move to the second pillar. Now I would like to ask you, please, could you choose 5 key terms that you consider effective for teaching and learning? And then we will discuss it briefly. Give you a couple of minutes for this. Any ideas? What do you consider or you relate to these notions of effective teaching and learning? So when you are, after you have started the design and the planning of your course, when you are actually teaching and facilitated learning, which are these, let's say, key terms that come to your mind or you try to develop in your courses? Good, concentration, interest, purpose. Any other terms? Real interest, that is good. Concept, association, motivation, connection with reality. Excellent. Collaboration. Curiosity, yes, this is very important, actually. This is extremely important. If you cannot awake the curiosity of your students, it is going to be very difficult that actually you can activate your students and you can have an effective, active learning environment. Yeah, taking into account student needs, exactly. Good, so we have already here some terms. I will now show you what actually I consider when I'm teaching and learning a course are the main pillars for me. So one of the main pillars is, since I want to facilitate that the students are autonomous, that they can, that the learning is student-centered, I facilitate processes of co-creation. This might sound now very abstract, but in a second you will see actually how I did this in one of my courses. Another one that was also mentioned by you is how you can facilitate collaborative learning in the class. Also, as you have seen, I use a lot of the term facilitates, to facilitate. Why? Because I believe that the teacher should be a facilitator, not just a kind of authority anymore, right? So it's a kind of coach, the role that the teacher should have in the actual teaching of a class. Activation is very important. How to develop a peer interaction and make sure that the students are also developing a sense of ownership during the class, and also how to provide in-class feedback and real application of the knowledge that has been obtained. I'm going to jump over the other Mentimeter slide that I had prepared for you, and then straight away explain to you which are the main elements that I consider essential for the pillar 3 that I label as feedback and meta-learning. So purpose, so it's important that our students, they understand that when they are learning something, is for a purpose. It has some kind of way of being translated into a real world issues, real world problems that the students actually experience, not only in the class, but also outside of the class. It's very important that feedback is very clear, is consistent, is personalized, which is something that Perusall is great at helping us with. And also it allows us to develop their meta-awareness, because if we develop the meta-awareness of the students, therefore this meta-learning experience is assured. So then what I did was to, let's say, this is my formula, this is my recipe, so to speak, what I call aprender haciendo. that was inspired by Eric's great pioneering work. So basically what I did was to take the flipped classroom that most of you are familiar with. I connected the flipped classroom concept with the techniques and the ideas developed by Eric Mazur on peer instruction. And then I used Perusall in order to make sure that all these different goals were absolutely obtained and attained and meet at the end of the course. And my students could also reach this mastery in the competencies that I want them to be trained on. So this is the final part of my presentation. What I'm going to discuss now and to present to you is one of my courses, a course that is kind of popular here in Groningen that is called Imagining Europe's Tomorrow. So in this course, I have one group seminar twice a week. In the students' evaluation, the structure received very good grades, or the maximum grades, and the interaction received the maximum grades in the last editions. So my goal here is not actually to simply say, okay, this is working, and using this kind of recipe that connects the flipped classroom together with peer instruction and uses Perusall as a catalyzer for facilitating intrinsic motivation, autonomy in the students, that the students are prepared and active not only before the class, but also during the class. What I think is interesting is to explain the why actually this is working. Well, one of the reasons why this course is working is because there's something very specific, something with purpose that the students they have to produce by the end of the course, which is a course which is a project-based teaching and learning. So they have to deliver a vision report. What is the vision report? So, well, each student should create a white paper like the one that was created by the European Commission some years ago, but with their own interest, with actually explaining and problematizing and thinking critically about the future Europe they want to live in by 2025. So this is not me telling them, okay, you have to write a report with some of your ideas about what is the Europe you would like to live in by this date. But actually, what I initiate with them is a process of co-creation. So this course is team-based, study case and project-based learning, where we are solving real-world problems. So the point of departure are these 5 scenarios posed as 5 different possibilities or questions or research questions about what would involve or be actually to choose one of these scenarios if we want to rethink the way Europe is at this moment articulated and actually integrated and so on, and to connect then to real world issues such as those provided by the Sustainable Development Goals. So this is how actually looks like the course organizer of this particular course. So my students, they have a first seminar that is on Tuesdays, where we have different role plays and activities that happened in a synchronous way in the class. But then they have to work during the entire week with the text in Perusall. So the white paper about the future of Europe is in Perusall, and they have to engage in a critical reading of this particular policy paper, but from the lenses of a cultural expert or a literary expert. So then in the seminar 2, which is on a Thursday, so the sequentiation is on Tuesday, we have the first seminar, then Perusall deadline is on a Wednesday, so I have enough time to look at all the analytics provided by Perusall. On a Thursday, I come to my class. And in this class, already I have all the information that usually I didn't have with traditional modes of teaching. So what I do, thanks to Perusall, is to actually apply all the ideas I showed to you before, all these design and principles for teaching and learning, and I create an asynchronous community of inquiry that is departing from questions that actually are not posed by me, but actually are posed by the students. The first weeks, I do a little bit of scaffolding. I help them to get some orientation. But as Eric explained before, I use the Socrates philosophy of teaching. So instead of giving them certainty, what I do give them is a lot of uncertainty. I pose challenging questions that they need to reply. And also I ask them to actually pose questions. As you can see, this is the Confucian report, which is one of the amazing tools embedded in Perusall. So usually I have a very large group of students. So imagine if I have to read every comment of every student and also look at all the different interactions. So what Perusall does for me is to already select which are the topics, these parts of the text which are more challenging for the students. So I have all sort of information regarding not only the performance of my students within this community of inquiry, but actually which are the things, the themes and the topics and the questions that are really important for them. So with this, I facilitate the co-creation, and the students are at the real center of the learning process. As you can see here on the screen, the main topics that we discussed that particular week about these particular key words and ideas were actually questions that I never wrote for them, but actually that's they created for this community of inquiry. One of the best research questions that was posed by my student regarding this white paper about the future of Europe was this one by one of my students who wrote that regarding the different scenarios that were proposed by the policymakers of the European Union. He was critically already reflecting on this, asking to the rest of the community, do you think that the EU has sufficient responses for important contemporary questions like the disintegration, integration of Europe, and that the only way is forward? In other words, which of the 5 scenarios do you think is the most adequate? Feel free to combine scenarios, since we should read the text in an activist way. So actually what I do with the Confucian report is to use it as a trigger for content retrieval and co-creation. So basically with the Confucian report, what I do is to assure that the learning experience is not coming from my supervision, but actually from the real interest of my students. And then we initiate what I call the discussion lab. So instead of basically having kind of passive transfer of knowledge, what I do in the class is I stay not as occupying the centrality of the class, but actually facilitating the discussion within this discussion lab. And what we did in this particular class was that the students, they had to choose one scenario, defend it, and therefore, as you have already seen before, this implies that they were co-creating, learning how to provide feedback, and their meta-learning and meta-awareness was increasing. In other words, I was putting into practice my ideas about creating and understanding. One of the results was not only individual critical thinking, and this is one of the achievements of Perusall, to turn a solitary task, which is reading, into a collective and collaborative task. So also we can turn critical thinking into a collective and collaborative action. And this is very interesting because actually I asked my students what was missing in that particular policy paper, and so they came with this very interesting idea about how actually culture understood culture as dominant cultural patterns, narratives that influence the political activity of European states and its citizens, both on a national and a European level. So this was actually missing from the entire document of policy that was aimed at designing the future of Europe. So that's allowed us to actually pose more difficult questions, such as how is citizenship oriented, defined, shaped by pervasive cultural narratives, and we could discuss topics related to the social engineering and the notion of citizenship from different perspectives, and also relate this to actual pieces of fiction and literature that were written. Perhaps many of you know this book as some kind of children's book, but actually it was not. It was a political treatise under the shape of this fantastic story written by Jonathan Swift. with giants and dwarfs and so on, which actually brought us to an example of a real world problem. So it led us to rethink how there are certain metaphors that are important for defining, for orientating how we think Europe, and how pervasive, for instance, a metaphor such as the European fortress became, and how we can in a process of co-creation provide new solutions for such complex problems such as the migration crisis. We can engineer new metaphors that could orientate decision-making in a different way by rejecting these institutional metaphors and perhaps providing different ones, such as the umbrella metaphor that was finally appropriated by the European Commission and used for actually including this idea of instead of a Europe that excludes, Europe that protects in their latest migration policy model. So I'm going to finish with these slides with an open question, since Eric and I, we love to pose questions in order to activate discussion and so on. My suggestion is that perhaps we are now in the crossroads, and it's important to move to a new learning model where we overcome the auctoritas model, the traditional model, which is teacher-centered, where the transfer of content is one of the main pillars. When there is a remembering-based approach and students are mostly passive in their learning process, and there is a strong punishment-oriented mentality focused on the final exam, and replace this by what I call a co-creation model, which is student-centered, where the content is produced by means of creating and understanding complex problems and connecting these to real-world issues, where instead of remembering, we are putting the focus on retrieving information and working with long-term memory, where students are mostly active in the learning process, and which is a research question oriented. Then the focus is in the learning process, not actually in the punishment. So thank you very much for your time, and now time for questions and answers.
I want to thank Professor Mazur and Professor Pablo Valdivia for this very captivating conference. I see. I was looking at the exchange of the people. All the people are really very interested in this conference, in this presentation, well, in this workshop actually, and we have a lot of questions, a lot. So, Professor Mazur, may you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. We only have about 5 minutes, and we have 4 questions. So,
oh my God.
Maybe the first one, I'll let you address it, Pablo, and I'll take the next one from Diego. Patricia's question. I mean, I certainly have ideas how to answer Patricia's question, but I'd love to hear your ideas. So Patricia, how do you manage student beliefs about learning? Right. And yes, there's the constant pushback of students because they want a lecture. They think, you know, oh, I learned from a lecture because I'm not getting confused. And if you ask me questions, I always get confused. So please lecture me. So how do you manage these beliefs?
Yeah, this is a very good question because I get this a lot in my own courses. Also, there's this misperception sometimes from the side of the students that this kind of courses, they are very light in terms of content because they are not asked to memorize anything, right? So what I think is key is that actually they engage into the learning experience by addressing their meta-learning, let's say, knowledge or meta-learning skills. Something I always do in the first class is there is this, I don't have now a copy with me, but there's this famous experiment, I think was created in the US, where you are given a lot of circles and you are asked to draw as many objects you can in a given time. And in the sections, it's never said that actually you have to draw within the circle. You can connect the circles, you can do whatever you want. So that instruction is not there. So this is the icebreaker I always use for the first class. So then I on purpose ask the students to reflect on why most of them, because usually most of them, they draw everything within the circles, and they ask them to think out of the circle in that sense, right? So that they need to develop this notion of meta learning, because it's going to allow them to see reality in a different way as they manage in that particular exercise to see their own understanding of that particular task in a different way. And these sort of icebreakers, usually they really work well in class.
Yeah, I fully concur with you. And I think it comes back to the issue of ownership, and it comes back to the issue of assessment, right? I mean, if students know that they'll be assessed on memorization, then why do anything else but a lecture? You know, because you don't need to struggle to understand. So I think it's actually very important to follow through on what you say. I think it was Patricia, yes, Patricia, and to actually actively manage students' belief. If you just let them go, I mean, in fact, in my book on peer instruction, one of the first chapters is completely devoted to motivating the students for the approach. Even before I thought about it very deeply, and it was when I wrote the book all the way in the beginning in 1997. I realized that I had to find a way to motivate the students, and one of them is through changing the assessment. So we only have about 1 minute left, right, Pablo? Is that correct?
I think we have a little bit more. Perhaps Jorge can.
No, we have more time.
We have more time. Yeah,
no problem.
I think we have more time. Yes.
Okay. I think the important is to exchange with the people, and the people are really, really very interested in the question.
Okay, good.
Yeah, please.
So we have more time, Egil. Don't worry.
Yeah, no problem
yes,
at all.
And,
no problem at all.
Okay, so maybe I'll take Diego's question, who is asking about the connection between peer instruction and Jean Piaget. It's really more Vygotsky than Piaget, frankly. And I don't know to what extent people who are here are interested in the psychology or in the cognitive psychology, but there's a very strong basis between the two. And rather than telling you about it, what I suggest you do, Diego, is to go to Google Scholar, scholar.google.com, and type in peer instruction in quotation marks. So quote peer instruction, unquote. If you don't put the quotation marks, it will look for pages where the word peer and instruction appear separately. By having the quotation marks, you keep the two words together. And you will find that there are thousands of articles that have been published on peer instruction. There's one from my former postdoc while Pablo answers another question. I'll try to find it and I'll put it in the chat. But she actually has an article on why peer instruction works. And then there's a person at Ohio State who has collaborated with people in China at Beijing Normal University to research both in a Chinese settings and in an American setting for a large state institution, what it is, what is the theoretical underpinning for peer instruction. So there's a lot to say about that, but since we have limited time, I thought I'd just point you in the right direction. So there are two more questions, Pablo. One is about staying away from taboo issues, which is probably better handled by you because in physics, there aren't that many taboo issues. So, but I'm sure that you touch on a lot of taboo issues.
Yes, actually, what we do is to embrace these sort of conflicts. Something that works very well is that when there is a sensitive issue or something that might be problematic or that would be connected to some kind of a strong polarization, what we do is actually to become very factual and expose the students to, well, basically these views that they do not agree with. But for doing so, before you have to train them on bias, on how actually to deal with confirmation bias or the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? So something that we always do in the first classes is actually to reflect, to critically reflect and to engage with these sort of biases and how this constructivist approach that we use allow us to have, for instance, role plays and panel debates that help really a lot to deal with this taboo. So just to give you a very specific example, I have had students with very strong views about migrants in a very negative way. And well, basically what I do is to create a role play where students, they have all to come with to a solution of the problem of the migration crisis. And what I do is always to well, ask them to take different roles to those that they are in real life supporting, right? So if somebody has a very negative views about migration, then that person has to defend the position of somebody who will be an advocate for migrants, right? So by doing this sort of exercise in a controlled, nice atmosphere where students, they can't distance themselves, then I never encounter a problem whatsoever in any of my courses. Not here in Groningen, not in Amsterdam, not before in Nottingham.
So there was one question that disappeared. I don't know, it's probably been tagged as answered, but I did want to address it. I think it was Joseph Potvin's question, who was interested in designing high quality polls. So I think, that books have been written about it. I wrote a book about polls in physics. I know there's one in astronomy. There's one, I mean, there are many different books that have questions in different disciplines. I think that the main point is that they have to be questions where you can argue about the answer, right? So anything that is at the lowest level of Bloom's taxonomy, a true, false, yes, no answer, a fact-based question would not be the right one, right? I mean, in what year did World War II end? 1943, 1945, 1948, 1983. Right, and then you pick an answer, but then if somebody has another answer, how do you discuss that? Do you Google it on your phone? That's not really interesting. So I would say in the humanities, it's probably more a question that is about interpretation, right? Why did a certain author or certain artist or painter or sculptor represent something, and it might not have a correct answer because we don't know. The artist might be dead, and we cannot unfortunately ask why the artist did something or wrote something in a certain way. But still, you could get your students to think and argue like an art historian or a humanist by posing them a question, have them talk to each other. And it doesn't have to be a true or false answer. It could be an answer that is true in the mind of certain scholars and not true in the mind of other scholars. The idea is this: it's not the answer that matters, but the reasoning that leads to the answer. It's the thinking that matters, and it's a great way of encouraging students to think. But the one maybe principal design rule is it should never, ever be a fact-based question. Right? It should always be a question that requires some type of cognitive process, like an interpretation question. We have many more questions coming. I unfortunately will have to leave in about 9 minutes because I have another meeting. It's just, I have a long day ahead. I teach now because my students are spread over the entire world. Okay, literally, I have students in Bahrain, I have students in Israel, I have students in London, I have students here in Boston even, I have students in San Francisco, I have students, towards New Zealand. So I cannot, when I get together with my students, I have to do it twice. I have to have two sections, one very early in the morning at 7:30 a.m. and I have another one in the afternoon so that all time zones can get access to the live session. Do you want to take another question and then I'll take one more?
Sorry, Professor
Yes.
Mazur, so maybe the last one, I think, because
Okay.
We have the starting of the next session in a few minutes. So I think last one. I don't know what do you prefer.
No, that's fine. I think that's very good. So that's good for me too, because unfortunately, I have to leave. Did you look at the remaining questions, Pablo?
Yes, I looked at the remaining questions, and I think I see some connections. So perhaps we can have a kind of final answer to some of these, because they are about how to develop this sort of peer instruction, flipped classroom, teaching modes together with Perusall. That is more or less what I can see connected here, and how colleagues have difficulties to improve the activation of students. Well, from my side, to answer why Perusall is different and how it helps you, I think I should use the words of Eric when he said some time ago that for him, Perusall was liberating. And I think that is the real game changer, because the problem is that without Perusall, you are so much limited to actually use different bits of technology and also try to integrate them and so on and so forth. But the great thing about Perusall is that it gives you freedom, and also it democratizes knowledge. And this is what I really like. Basically, with Perusall, you can facilitate these processes of co-creation. And again, I'm going to repeat some of Eric's words, because I think they are very important. What is key is the learning process, the reasoning, but not actually if your student is going to get quickly to right or wrong answer, right? And because there are many elements of judgment that sometimes they are not based on the A or B response, but actually conflicts, contradictions, and so on and so forth. And this is what you want to explore. And if you want to explore this efficiently, you need the information that Perusall gives you before the class. So not only the students are ready before the class, but you as a facilitator, you are ready to provide the best possible supports for your students.
I think that's a great answer, and thank you for quoting me. I mean, you've been a pioneer in applying this in the humanities, so you deserve a lot of credit there. Well, Jorge, back to you, since we have to wrap up here.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very, very, very much to you, Professor Mazur, and to Professor Valdivia for this amazing and very, very interesting workshop and conference, actually. And I think all the people were really very attached with this conference, and a lot of interaction in the. It's amazing. Even in conferences, when you have in present person there are not that kind of interaction, and not only the people were staying here in this room, but also some people were connected to the YouTube Live. And the idea is to we're going to record all these conferences and exchange with people that I think they are very, very interested in education and new ways to educate our students, and to not just to transmit information, but really make interaction between the peers. And I was reading all the comments, and many people they didn't know this Perusall platform. And I think many people are really very interested in this kind of education and way to conduct learning. And I think if you want to, if the public want to contact Pablo or Professor Mazur, I think through us we can deliver you the information or the addresses. And I ask for applause.
Jorge, if I may, for just a second, Perusall just asked me to have another series of workshops, and these are workshops where you actually use Perusall. It's called Transform Your Teaching with Perusall. So I'm going to put the link to
please
in the chat, and you may want to, if there's a time that works for you,
absolutely.
There it is. So please copy the link before you leave, but you can also find it on Twitter, because if you follow my Twitter account, I will be tweeting it. So anyway, thank you all so much. It was wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you to you, Professor Mazur. Thank you to Professor Valdivia. And I ask for a virtual applause, please.
Wonderful. And applause for you. Thank you all so much.
And thank you for being here and exchanging with us all your knowledge and experiences. And I think it's very, very important for us as teachers to exchange all about this information to give to us. Thank you very, very, very much. For us, it's a big honor to have you here in our Congress.
My pleasure. Hasta luego.
Hasta luego.